Good evening, everybody. My name is Kathy Alderman. I'm the Chief Communications and Public Policy Officer for the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. I'm honored to be joined by my colleagues here, Aubrey Wild and Andrew West, who are really my partners in legislative crime during the session. And we're going to be covering what we accomplished, what we were looking at, what we accomplished, and what you can learn from our very exciting session this year. Can we go to the next slide? Just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. We do have live captioning available, so if you need that service, you can use the bottom toolbar to select show captions. We're gonna, as I mentioned, we're gonna go over kind of how we approach legislative session, what was before us, what our priorities were, and what legislation actually passed, what didn't pass, what got through, what didn't get through, and then how you can stay involved with us. We're also going to provide you with a couple of resources. We'll provide those links in the chat as the conversation moves along, so don't feel like you need to take notes. We are keeping cameras and microphones off, but please do use the chat to introduce yourselves, to provide feedback, and then use the Q&A to ask questions so that we can make sure we get to everyone's questions at the end. This is being recorded and will be shared later this week after we got to download it and get it all ready and all that stuff. And we also encourage all of you, if you are active on social media, to feel free to share what you're hearing by using the hashtag at COCoalition and tagging it for the CCH Ed series. Next slide. So I'm going to pass this off, I believe, to my colleague Aubrey Wild, who's going to talk about the legislative session and how we started this year, and that'll kind of lead us up to all of the mischief that we got into.
I'm going to let Andrew jump in here, and then I'll pick it up in just a few slides.
Great. Thank you, Kathy, for the warm introduction, and thank you, Aubrey, for kicking it off to me. And I'm going to start here with a bit about how a bill becomes a law. I will note that while I'll be talking about things that actually occur under the Gold Dome at the State House, a lot of these bill concepts and ideas start well before that. And ideas for bills can be brought forward by legislators, by nonprofit organizations and coalition groups working together, or community members. So a lot of that work leading up to the legislative session goes sort of unseen, but stakeholdering and coalition meetings occur well before that. And the state of Colorado actually has a diagram of how a bill becomes a law, but at the coalition, we wanted to make it a bit more pretty, a bit more digestible. So along with this legislative wrap-up session tonight, we'll be releasing a little bit of a how-to on how to access the process, different materials and resources that we use at the coalition throughout the session to stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll be releasing that soon. But I'll provide a bit of an overview here. And next slide. So how a bill becomes a law. A bill begins by being introduced to its original chamber, be that the Senate or the House, where as the concept is presented, it is given an official bill title and a bill number, which is used to track the bill throughout the session. And along with that, it's assigned to a committee hearing. What committees are is a subgroup composed of several members of the legislature that are appointed to serve as advisors on a particular area, whether that be agriculture, natural resources, health and human services, housing, local government, education, or more. Committee members meet and discuss certain concepts of bills that are brought forward to them based on this issue area. So in the committee hearing, the sponsors, who are the lead legislators on the bill, present the bill to the larger committee. They give a bit of an introduction to the bill, what it was, how the idea came about, the implications of the bill for Colorado law. And following that quick presentation, there's an opening up of the floor to public testimony. And testimony is often nonprofit leaders, community members, and a lot of people who just want to weigh in on the bill, who help educate and inform legislators on why they're supporting, opposing, or seeking to amend the bill, and what the implications will be. After that public testimony component in the committee hearing, if the bill does not get a favorable vote, it doesn't make it out of the committee hearing. I mean, it's considered dead. Dead is just what we call any bill that doesn't advance on to the next part of the process. Otherwise, it'll do one of two things. If the bill has a fiscal note, so that means that it has a financial cost associated with a piece of legislation, it'll move into appropriations, which is another committee, but they decide what to do about certain bills when it comes to the fiscal note and the financial component. If the bill does not have a fiscal note, it'll move to second reading, which instead of the smaller group of committee members, it'll be a larger chamber of all the either representatives or senators. And that's in the second reading, there's more debate on the bill. They can often say, hey, here's why we're supporting this bill, here's why I oppose. And a lot of that debate actually happens in the second reading. The second reading is followed by a more informal vote where legislators give just a voice vote. So it's a yay or nay. And the third reading tends to have less debate. Amendments are usually brought forward earlier in the process. So if they weren't brought forward in the committee hearing, amendments to the bill will usually be brought in the second reading, although it is possible to have them be brought forward in the third. And the third reading, the final step, is where legislators actually make that vote. Everyone has to vote, and they all record their votes in a little machine on the floor. So that's the general process for the first chamber. And can we go to the next slide? Thank you very much. The second chamber very closely mirrors the process in the first chamber. So once it gets through that first chamber, say it was the Senate, it will then move to the House, where the House will do the same thing. They'll have a committee hearing for the bill. It has to be assigned when it's introduced to the House. It's assigned to a committee hearing. They have the same process of public testimony, and then they move to the second reading and third reading. If the bill is passed in the second chamber and there are no amendments, it's considered passed, and it goes to the governor's desk, where the governor can either sign the bill into the law. That's sometimes a formal process, sometimes not. The governor can let the bill become law without signing it, or the governor can veto the bill. If the bill is passed with amendments, it must return back to the first chamber. So for example, if our bill was introduced in the Senate, it then moves to the House. If the House decides to make amendments to that Senate bill, the Senate has to go back and say, hey, we accept these amendments, in which case it's passed, or they can reject the amendments, where it goes to a negotiation process, usually a conference committee with members of both the House and the Senate to negotiate the bill. And like I mentioned earlier, if it doesn't pass any of these steps, the bill is considered dead. If it doesn't receive a vote, or sometimes legislators the sponsors of the bill might say, you know, I had an idea for this bill, but along the process, my mind has been changed, and I would like to move the bill to be postponed indefinitely or killed. So that's a bit of an overview on the legislative process. I'll leave it at that for now, but I do want to reiterate that we are releasing a short how-to with a bunch of tips and tricks and resources for all things legislative session that we'll be sending along after this.
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Aubrey Wild, and I'm the Advocacy Program Director at the Coalition, and I'm excited to be here with Andrew and Kathy tonight. And in giving a legislative overview about what happened this session, I think it's important to start with some context about who represents all of us at the Capitol. So at the Capitol, there are 100 lawmakers, 65 representatives, and 35 senators. There's one senator for every district and 65 total representatives. And then there's an even split between men and women. And there are 32 first-time legislators this year, which created a bit of a learning curve for a lot of folks. And you'll notice there are more blue dots here on that visual than red dots, meaning that there is a Democratic majority. So we're here because we just wrapped up the first regular session of the 74th General Assembly. We convened on January 9th and adjourned 120 days later, which is constitutionally mandated on May 8th. And I would say that there are three major factors that influenced this legislative session, both the politics and the policy. First was the recent election and the increased Democratic majority. So Democrats recently increased their majority in both chambers. In the Senate, there are now 23 Democrats and 12 Republicans. And in the House, there are 46 Democrats and 19 Republicans. So what this meant is unprecedented control for Democrats, but also pretty serious divisions within those Democratic caucuses in each chamber. So this meant that this also meant that legislators were getting a little bit of a late start on the legislative process, some of that pre-work that Andrew was talking about because of the election. I think some of these outcomes, this increase in the majority in both chambers was a little bit unexpected. So people really had to hit the ground running on day one of the legislative session, and it made for a little bit of a frenzy there at the beginning and then towards the end as well. Second is partisan goals. At the outset of the legislative session, top Democratic Party leaders, including Senate President Fenberg, who was a returning leader, and House Speaker McCleskey, who was a new to this leadership position, all expressed support for policies addressing housing and environment, health, childcare, gun violence, civil rights protections for LGBTQ folks, reproductive rights, and so on. All of the things that help make Colorado a more affordable, healthier, safer place to be. And this was considered by many a continuation of the work that was started in the previous year. And then the minority party, led by Senator Lundeen, similarly was a returning leader, and then Representative Lynch, who is the new leader, entered the session with the primary goal of defending what you might consider traditional conservative principles like individual freedom, trust in market forces, and limited government intervention. And that was drawn from those initial speeches that were given by these leaders. And then third, I'd say what was a major factor in the policy and politics was our advocate governor. Governor Polis is much more involved in shaping policies and determining their outcome before getting to his desk than other governors in recent memory. So that was very influential. Ultimately, the results were mixed, with about 79% of the bills that were introduced ultimately passing. But because of some of the conflict and controversy and infighting that happened, some high priority bills of the progressive legislators did become casualties of the process. But that said, the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless was really pleased with a lot of the policies that did get across the finish line that do help the people that we are here to represent and serve. And as usual, we work arm in arm with our staff, clients, and community to engage in advocacy at the Capitol. And as in previous years, CCH engaged in the legislative process in a number of different ways, from drafting bill language and amendments to participating in stakeholder convenings, engaging in direct and grassroots lobbying, and providing public and written testimony. And in total, we testified on 17 different bills, 29 different times. 21 of those times were live and 8 were written. So there are many different ways to engage, and it's not limited to just us either. We also had staff, clients, and community members engage in all of these parts of the process. The coalition also relies on its large network of about 25,000 individuals to engage in action alerts that we send out. So when there's a high stakes vote coming up, we'll send out an email asking you to reach out to your legislators and ask them to vote in a certain way. So that's grassroots lobbying. And this resulted this year in 871 messages to legislators in support of our priorities. And we also generated community awareness and support on social media. So keep us in mind on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. That's a really great way to share some of our priorities and generate that support. I also have to call out Danny McCarthy. He is our longtime lobbyist with Mendez, Barkas and Associates, and he's fabulous and helps us keep track of all the many bills that we track every year. Usually we track about a quarter of the bills that are introduced. This year we tracked 146. We actively engaged on 45 of those, and we achieved a desired outcome by some measures on about 90% of those bills, about 38 bills. This was a unique year. We ended in an amend position on a lot of different bills because we still wanted to tweak some of the provisions of those bills. And so this calculation includes those bills as well as the outright successes. So the failure rate is just those explicit failures where we supported something and it failed, or we opposed something and it ended up passing. And I encourage you to take a look at the end of the report we're going to release tonight to get a rundown of that full list of 45 bills. We'll just touch on some of the ones we engaged most on tonight. And we were really excited to finally have our first in-person lobby day since 2020, and nearly 80 staff and clients and community members participated. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. You can see some fun pictures from that day. It's my favorite day of the year. We had about 80 people participate. We got some training from Danny and from legislators around how to be effective advocates under the Gold Dome. And then participants had the chance to actually directly ask legislators for their support on 2 introduced bills and 1 bill concept, which was later wrapped into a separate larger bill. So we'll talk about all 3 of these here going forward. And just a huge thank you to everyone who participated in that day and every part of the legislative process this year. We couldn't have done it without you. It's also important to discuss the budget because this drives a lot of what policies and programs are possible. This year, the overall Colorado budget was over $38 billion. This grows by some measure every year because of inflation and growing needs. Most of this budget funds Colorado's 6 big agencies, which deal with local affairs, human services, corrections, education, finance, and judicial. We call these the Big 6. And the general fund also saw an increase. And this is the most flexible source of funding, generated largely by sales tax and income tax. And this was up to $14.7 billion this year. This largely grew because of increased state responsibility for Medicaid costs following the end of increased federal support for our Medicaid costs. And then on that note, I also want to mention that the legislature voted to remove the $1,500 annual Medicaid adult dental cap and eliminate the pharmacy and outpatient Medicaid copays through this budgeting process, which is really exciting. Ultimately, this means that people who are on Medicaid are able to get care that is more affordable. And we're really grateful to our partners at the Colorado Community Health Network for leading on this process. Another factor that really influenced this legislative session was overall a smaller amount of money that legislators could work with. The Joint Budget Committee set aside $30 million for legislators to allocate to their priorities pending approval by the Appropriations Committee, which Andrew mentioned. And so this left a little bit less room than in the last 2 years for new and expanded programs. In the last couple of years, we've had a lot of federal money coming in response to COVID. And so this year we didn't have all of those funds, but we were still able to work on a lot of exciting policies and programs. And with that, I'll send it to Kathy to talk about some of our specific policy priorities.
Great, thanks, Aubrey. Thanks, Andrew. Those are really good level setting conversations to have about what we were going into. As in many years prior, our legislative priorities really do focus in on housing and homelessness, renters protections to keep people housed, economic security, to make sure that people are getting access to the benefits that they need, the wages that they need to afford housing, access to public health and healthcare. We know that public homelessness is at its core a public health crisis, and access to healthcare is critically important for ensuring somebody's stability and success in housing. We're always looking at harm reduction and substance use issues, making sure that people have access to those resources and that type of care that they need to address that concern. And then addressing criminal legal reforms in the criminal legal system, because we know that there is a strong correlation between people entering the cycle of homelessness and staying in the cycle of homelessness because of their involvement with the criminal legal system. Next slide. So going into this legislative session, considering it was the year of housing, we recognized pretty early on that we really needed to be having some distinct conversations about two types of affordable housing. So when people generally, when the governor stands in front of the legislature and the legislature gives out its priorities and they say, we want to address affordable housing, we really think they're talking lowercase a, lowercase h affordable housing. That means housing that's affordable to people across the income spectrum. So for those exiting the cycle of homelessness, as well as those maybe looking to, to move out of the home ownership opportunity that they're in and into another home ownership opportunity. And we need to be focused on affordable housing across this income spectrum. But as we start to figure out how to address affordable lowercase a of housing across the income spectrum, we have to make sure that we're not having negative impacts on capital A affordable housing. And capital A affordable housing is the kind of housing that the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless owns and operates and helps people get into. And this is housing that is regulated by a source of funding that helped get the development to into the pipeline for folks to access as a housing option, or that might be subsidized by federal, state, or local funds in order for people to get into the housing through vouchers or rental subsidies. And what we saw throughout the process this session is kind of a conflation of, well, we want to address affordable housing and we're going to do it in a way that makes rules and regulations applicable to all types of housing, but ultimately would have targeted and made it more difficult to for us to continue to provide the type of capital A affordable housing that we provide. And so we did a lot of education, and one of the reasons why we stayed in an amend position on so many bills, as Aubrey mentioned, is because we really had to do some exceptions and some exemptions to make sure that we weren't overly trying to regulate already regulated housing. And one example, and Aubrey's going to talk about this, is when we start talking about rent stabilization. We certainly believe there need to be rent stabilization measures and that local governments can implement to help people with this high cost of housing. But what we don't want to do is doubly regulate or doubly stabilize rent that's already regulated by the federal government. And so we have to write out different language to make sure that this capital A affordable housing isn't negatively impacted, because this is the housing that is of the highest priority for us. This is where we believe public resources should be invested at the greatest degree, because this is where the greatest need is and where the greatest gaps are for low fixed income households and for people experiencing homelessness. Next slide. So to that point, we released right in the middle of session, probably our longest and most in-depth report on the housing crisis in Colorado. We will put a link in the chat for you to access this full report, as well as the 3-pager that summarizes it. But this is the case that we're making, that we've been making, and now it's on paper so people can read it and don't just have to listen to us talk about it, that we're making for using public resources for the greatest needs, using those dollars to develop capital A affordable housing, to use those dollars for those households that are low and fixed income or that are trying to exit the cycle of homelessness. And it was timely that we released this during session, though I'm not sure my team appreciated the extra workload, though they did an amazing job. And as you read this report, I think you're going to really find there are some really great facts and really great narratives on why we need to use our public resources in this way. Because this really aligned well with the land use bill and the conversations that we were having about ensuring affordability and ensuring anti-displacement measures and really combating this notion of trickle-down housing. Because if you attended our last or one of our last ed series, you got to hear us really talk about some of the information in this report and the fact that there are legislators and elected officials that believe supply alone is going to solve the lowercase affordable A crisis. And that's just not true. If you don't target resources, if you're not intentional about using public resources and investing in capital A affordable housing, we're never going to be able to solve the housing crisis for those households that are most in need and that have had the most historical barriers in accessing housing. And so this report really combats that narrative, gives you some data and some facts to combat that narrative, and makes the case for why affordability, anti-displacement, and intentionality about targeting resources are critical components to our policy work. Next slide. So I've mentioned a couple of the housing bills that we worked on, but want to just talk through some of the other ones that we were a key partner on. The very first bill that was introduced in the Senate was the Authority of Public-Private Collaboration, creating a unit for affordable housing to transfer state land for affordable housing projects. Unfortunately, as introduced, the bill didn't actually say anything about affordability. And so we worked with the sponsors to ensure that when we're using really limited public land, that it is targeted for affordable housing. It is targeted for households living, at 80% AMI or below in most communities, but at the very least that aligns with the demonstrated needs that a local community has through a local housing needs assessment that uses objective data. And why this is important is because we know that there are communities, unfortunately, across the state of Colorado that will not target resources for households of the greatest need because they'd rather build middle income housing or high-end housing because that attracts a different sort of community. And these communities are really struggling to keep workers in their area, to allow people to live near where they go to school or where they're getting healthcare services. And so we really want to make sure that this very limited state resource is used for deeply affordable housing so that people can live where they work, people can live where they go to school and where they're getting healthcare services. Another bill that we worked on, House Bill 231190, is also called the right of first refusal, or as some people call it, which I think sounds like a dog's name, is ROFR. This is a bill that allows local governments the opportunity to purchase multifamily for sale properties. So for instance, if an apartment building with 100 units goes up for sale in a local government, this would give the local government the opportunity to purchase it before it goes to the market. The reason this is so important is because what we're seeing in community after community in Colorado is the corporate purchase or the private purchase of multifamily homes that are currently affordable today. But after that purchase, they're converted, they're rehabbed, they're upgraded, and they're no longer affordable to the households that were likely displaced because of the purchase. So this gives the local government a limited opportunity to intervene in that process and try to at least preserve some affordability in their localities. This bill did go through a great deal of amendments. There are many more exceptions in it than I think we would like to see. And there's an opportunity, I think, to see how it works over the next year or two and come back and maybe clean it up. But I think one of the things that was really critical to us is that there are capital A affordable housing projects today that are coming near expiration, meaning that their funding source is no longer going to require that they maintain that affordability. And this kind of creates at least one more step in the process to protect those properties in those local communities so that people aren't displaced and so that people can continue to access that type of housing. Another bill that we certainly didn't expect to work on was Senate Bill 23, and this kind of was going to reclassify and post publicly anywhere that had the manufacturing of certain illegal substances. And we, again, didn't expect to get involved in this, but we started to realize that by publishing this information, you're not actually saying that that home has been remediated. So in instances in some of our properties and many properties, illegal substances will be used or produced on the property. And testing will demonstrate that substance has been used. But we work very closely with remediation firms that will come in and rehab the property back to its original state so that it is safe for individuals and families to live there. And without stating that remediation has happened, we're kind of taking housing that could be available to lower income households off the market by determining that it's unsafe. And so we wanted to make sure that the remediation and that the parties that do that remediation were recognized in this bill. Next slide, please. And then we did, as I mentioned, work extensively on what was referred to as the land use bill. As originally contemplated, the land use bill was going to set up a housing needs assessment process, was going to allow for ADUs, was going to allow for middle housing, which is often townhomes, condos, some multifamily development, was going to allow for some transit-oriented development, some smart growth initiatives, and had some water provisions to make sure that water wouldn't be impacted. As we started the conversation, we realized that there was no direct affordability requirements in allowing this more dense development. And in addition to that, there were no anti-displacement requirements. And so what we envisioned and what we know is happening across the state of Colorado is that high-end development is absolutely displacing community after community, making it unaffordable for the households that are getting displaced. And it's not ensuring that the people that currently live there can actually access the housing that's being built, the new housing that's being built, whether that's ADUs or whether that's middle housing. What we've seen in a lot of areas is that single family zoning, when eliminated without affordability requirements, means that the developer can come in, completely raise a single family home and put up 6 new homes. Well, if those new homes aren't affordable to the household that was just displaced, then we're just creating more impact on the affordability housing crisis. And so we worked very hard throughout the process to insert more affordability requirements into the bill to ensure that local governments across the state and all communities are identifying affordability strategies when they're addressing the needs that they have identified in their housing needs assessment. We also wanted to make sure that local governments are adopting anti-displacement measures so that when they start allowing for more dense housing development, they're not displacing households without options for them to be rehoused or to be compensated for the property that they've lost. And we were pretty successful in getting some really good language into this bill throughout the process. But as Aubrey said, there were some casualties of the legislative process that were due to many of the things that she highlighted as issues this year. This was the governor was leading on this bill, and legislators did not feel like they were being brought in and consulted enough on the provisions of the bill. There was some infighting even within the party about the right approach for this bill. And then it really became the victim of a huge property tax discussion that happened at the end of session as people started to receive their property tax notices. And as expected, those notices showed great growth in property tax and relief for individuals and households needed to be provided by the legislature, which caused a great deal of consternation, mostly among the Republican Party, who have eventually walked out the night that the property tax bill was being discussed. And so I think because of these reasons, the land use bill, didn't get its final hearing in the Senate and did eventually die. So I think we'll see parts and pieces of this land use bill reappear because there were parts that were very popular, and there are parts that will definitely make a difference for housing. And one of the concepts that we were able to get into the land use bill that it will be one of our top priorities next year is the creation of a affordable housing and homelessness standing committee or legislative oversight committee and task force, so that we have a place to track the spending on affordable housing, to make sure that our policies are aligned and not contradictory, to make sure we're studying best practices in the development of affordable housing, capital A, affordable housing, and addressing homelessness. And so we'll lead with that probably next session. And we're glad now that we have the language to get it kickstarted. Another bill that did pass that was about land use planning was House Bill 1255, which basically says that local governments can no longer implement growth caps or limitations on the development of housing in their communities. Many communities, unfortunately, have implemented these growth caps, and it's essentially just closed their doors to new development and to the development of affordable housing. And that just pushes people further out from where they work, where they live, or where they go to school, et cetera. And so this would eliminate the ability of local governments to do those growth caps. On House Bill 1304, voters passed in November of last year, Proposition 123, which will dedicate hopefully around $300 million a year to affordable housing development and homelessness resolution. And we really needed to get involved on this implementation bill, which was largely some technical changes, but also provided an exception process for rural resort communities who do have different housing needs that we believe will be demonstrated by their local housing needs assessments. So if they need to build for higher income households, they can use these funds in limited exceptions. And so we really wanted to make sure that we shaped that so that it wasn't a free-for-all. So you couldn't start using public funds to build any kind of housing for any kind of household when the voters said that they wanted these funds to go to low-income households and to resolve homelessness. Outside of the legislation, we were able to get an agreement both from legislators, but from the administering agency of these dollars, that nonprofit providers can access the homelessness resolution funds, whether or not the local government opts into the affordable housing provisions of Proposition 123. And that's going to be a huge benefit because those dollars will start flowing in July. And that means that we can start addressing the crises and the emergencies of homelessness on the street today with those immediate funds. The last bill I'll mention, I think before I turn it over to my colleagues, is House Bill 1068, which to me was really one of the earliest and most obvious issues of this capital A affordable housing and affordable housing crisis issues, because the pet animal ownership and housing was really targeted at state or federal funded housing. Well, that type of housing is capital A affordable housing. That's the housing that is already regulated in so many ways, and frankly is already regulated in what kind of pets and what kind of pet deposits can be charged in buildings. And so that kind of targeting a particular requirement to deeply affordable subsidized housing was not going to help households at low and middle incomes be able to bring their pets into housing. And so we really worked to make sure that that these provisions were applicable to all housing so that many more households would be able to stay with their pet and housing. And I think I now get to turn it back to Aubrey.
Thank you, Kathy. I'm going to dive into some renters protections. So still the year of housing, still a lot of focus on housing, but a little bit of a different angle. So the first bill, well, I'll say generally, to Kathy's point about making sure that people who are already providing capital A affordable housing are not over-regulated. We wanted to make sure that as an affordable houser, that we were striking a balance between strengthening protections for renters and preserving certain landlord interests and ensuring that affordable housers don't become overly burdened by duplicative or incompatible laws and regulations. So that was a focus in all of the bills I'm going to talk about. The first one is the one that I'm probably the most excited about. It's Senate Bill 184. And this bill concept was developed by CCH clients and housing navigators. So this is a great example of that off-season work that can happen that can lead to a successful bill during the legislative session. It has four main components. The first one ensures that fair housing violations based on a protected class, including source of income violations, can be raised as an affirmative defense to an eviction. So right now, even if the facts are indisputed that a landlord has discriminated against a tenant or a current tenant, they can actually still lose their home because it can't be raised as an affirmative defense. So this makes that crystal clear. Second, it caps security deposits at 2 times the monthly rent amount. This is important. Many other states already do this. Colorado joins about 28 other states and DC in limiting security deposits in some way. This level gives our housing navigators the opportunity to still kind of negotiate with prospective community landlords by saying it would be great if you could house our folks. We can offer additional compensation. But it also prevents really outrageous financial barriers for people who are trying to get into housing. Third, it allows landlords to require that renters demonstrate they earn at least 2 times the cost of rent, which allows renters to spend up to 50% of their income on rent. This essentially aligns with the housing trends that we're already seeing in Colorado. About half of Coloradans who rent are cost burdened. They're spending more than 30% of their income on rent. And currently the industry standard is to require prospective tenants to earn 3 times the rent amount in order to qualify for that home. So that locks a ton of people out of quality rentals. And so we want to make sure that folks are not ending up in substandard housing or on the street because of those really high financial barriers. And this would make, or this did make Colorado the first state in the nation to cap minimum income requirements for all renters, which is really exciting. While 3 times the rent amount is the industry standard, we've seen it as high as 5 times or 8 times. So I won't try to do the math for you right now, but this I think will make a really big difference for folks who are trying to find housing. And then finally, for tenants with housing subsidies, it specifies that 2 times or 200% minimum income standard applies only to the portion of rent for which the tenant is responsible. So I can do the math on this one. If the rent amount is $1,000 and the tenant is responsible for $100, and that voucher covers the rest of it, the landlord can ask that that tenant prove that they earn $200 a month, 200% of that tenant's rent amount. And also, this does another really exciting thing, which this answers the question of somebody in the chat. It disallows consideration of rental history for people with vouchers. And this makes Colorado the first state to do that, along with DC. This policy, we believe, still assures that tenants are well positioned to meet their financial obligations, but prevents displacement and homelessness, and will hopefully get folks into adequate housing. It also addresses the loophole left by House Bill 2013-32, which prohibits discrimination based on source of income. This was a gap in that policy that we recognized over the last few years, so we're glad to close that loophole. And I want to extend some thanks to CCH case manager David Taylor, who helped demonstrate the positive impact of this bill in testimony in committee. And this will be effective in August of 2023. The next bill here is House Bill 1099, and this will require a landlord to accept a portable tenant screening report from a prospective tenant. This will save landlords time, this will save tenants money and effort. We've heard too many stories of people spending all of their savings on tenant screening reports and application fees. So this will reduce the need to do that. There are a few caveats. A report must have been prepared within the previous 30 days, and it must be made available directly from that screening report agency. And also, if a tenant provides a portable screening report, the landlord is not permitted to collect an application fee unless that landlord only accepts 1 application at a time, conducts the screening, and returns the money to that applicant if they weren't accepted. And another shout out to Sam Moser, a bilingual family outreach associate with the Coalition. She testified in support of this bill in both chambers, making the point that not only will this save families money, it will actually help people exit homelessness more quickly. This bill also gives some teeth to the Rental Application Fairness Act, which governs a lot of the penalties and enforcement for renters protection statewide. It creates a $2,500 fine for unchecked violations and authorizes enforcement by the Attorney General's office, which is really exciting. And want to extend thanks also to Colorado Poverty Law Project, Progress Now Colorado, and others who led on this bill. And similarly to 184, this becomes effective August of 23. Next is House Bill 1120, and this requires landlord-tenant mediation before an eviction can be filed. It also increases the tenant timeline for a move out following an eviction from 10 days to 30 days for non-substantial violations as defined in statute. This policy only applies to tenants who have disclosed voluntarily that they receive federal disability benefits, so SSI or SSDI, or temporary assistance for needy families. Here in Colorado, it's called the Colorado Works Program. Notably, the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless negotiated for several amendments, but one in particular allowing nonprofit providers who already have mediation programs to not be further regulated by this bill. And this became effective upon the governor's, or will become effective upon the governor's signature. Next is House Bill 1186, and this was really led by the Colorado Kids Campaign, Colorado Poverty Law Project, our great partners. And this bill allows landlords and tenants and witnesses to participate in eviction proceedings virtually and also submit and file court documents electronically. This will be such a value for everybody involved. The state expects that this will benefit about 8,000 households. This is about 20% of households facing eviction every year who likely would automatically lose their home because they don't show up to court for whatever reason, might be transit issues, work conflicts, childcare, a disability that prevents someone from coming in person, who previously would have or otherwise would have faced a default eviction and wouldn't have had the opportunity to defend themselves. And this will become effective on January 1st of 2024. And the next bill is House Bill 1095. This prohibits certain harmful lease clauses. It's pretty weedy, so just a few of the top lines here are that these harmful lease clauses that are prohibited include waivers of the right to a jury trial, waivers of the right to join a class action or collective claim, and waivers of the right to peaceful enjoyment in that home. Again, we worked on amendments focusing on protecting affordable housers' interests, and we were able to move into a monitor position and then later into a support position because of that great stakeholding that went on. And this will become effective August of 23. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, not all bills made it to the governor's desk. There are two bills that I'll highlight here, one that Kathy mentioned. And unfortunately, these two bills were really the ones that were considered the most impactful in increasing housing affordability through renters protections. So I anticipate that we'll work with partners again on this in the future. The first one is House Bill 1171, Just Cause Eviction. And this would have prevented displacement and homelessness by prohibiting evictions without just cause, specifically at the time of lease renewal when a landlord might kick out a family so they can slap down some of that ugly gray vinyl in the kitchen and then jack the rent up by $500. So this died on the calendar when the Senate failed to raise it for debate in the final days of legislative session. And we were a stakeholder on this bill, successfully, again, advocated for some amendments that aligned the proposal with what we're already doing. And then similarly, House Bill 1115, this was a long-awaited bill. It would have repealed the longstanding prohibition on local rent control. And to Kathy's point, we worked on some amendments here to make sure we weren't being double regulated. And we're successful there, but ultimately it was killed in the Senate Local Government and Housing Committee on a party line vote. So yeah, again, we'll come back to this one in future sessions, I'm sure. And shout out to our partners like 9 to 5 Colorado, Together Colorado, United for New Economy, Colorado Homes for All, and Community Eviction Economic Defense Project for being leaders on this. And recognizing that we have a lot of bills that we worked on, I'm going to go really quickly through our economic security and public benefits bills that we engaged on. The first one was House Bill 1126, and Andrew West here was really our in-house champ on this bill, testified and helped shape that legislative process. But it was championed by our partner organization, Colorado Center on Law and Policy. And this bill prohibits consumer reporting agencies from including medical debt information on a credit report. People still have to pay their medical debt, but this won't impact a person's ability to buy a car or a home, for example. As I'm sure you can imagine, and many of you probably know this very personally from your own experiences, there's a deep intersection between medical debt and housing insecurity. In fact, research shows us that any amount of medical debt someone's holding can increase the amount of time that person experiences homelessness by an average of 2 years. So this will be really impactful for the folks we care most about. And these other 3 bills were championed by our partners at the Colorado Fiscal Institute, and this is a package that came together. The first one is 1006. This will require employers to inform employees of the availability of federal and state earned income tax credit and child tax credits, with the goal of increasing uptake on these important programs, and that did pass. House Bill 1112 will expand Colorado's EITC and CTC by a certain amount. And this passed with strong bipartisan support, which is really exciting. Research shows that tax policies like this are critical social determinants of health. Unfortunately, the third one, House Bill 1078, did not pass. This would have created a small boost in unemployment insurance benefits for parents and caregivers who lose their job through layoffs. Unfortunately, this didn't pass, but I'm sure we'll continue to work with our partners to advance meaningful and equitable tax policy and public benefits reforms. And with that, back to Andrew.
Great. Thank you very much, Aubrey. Everybody still with us here? I know, like Aubrey said, we got a lot of bills, but we've got a couple more sections here, and I'll try to wrap up relatively quickly. So the first one, House Bill 1300, is continuous eligibility Medicaid coverage. And this bill, like a lot of other bills from this year, was a response to some of the successes from the pandemic when the federal government enacted legislation that would allow anyone enrolled in Colorado's Medicaid or Child Health Plan Plus programs to maintain continuous eligibility throughout the pandemic, even if their eligibility changed. Now, as the public health emergency draws to a close, and just in the last couple months here, these protections are running out. So people will now have to go through the normal recertification process to stay enrolled in Medicaid and the CHIP program, which is really likely to result in mass disenrollments over the next few months. For those who still qualify for the program, there are a lot of administrative challenges, which we call administrative churn. And unfortunately, children and people of color are disproportionately likely to be disenrolled due to these administrative challenges. And for those who are no longer eligible for the program, they will also be bumped off their coverage. So what this bill does is that it extends continuous Medicaid and CHIP coverage continuously for children between the ages of 0 to 3, and for 12 months for those adults who are leaving carceral settings. And the way the bill does this is by requiring Colorado's Healthcare Policy and Financing Department, or HCPF, to submit a waiver to the federal government that will expand this continuous coverage. It also includes pro se automatic renewals for the lowest income adults, those with 0 income, who meet certain criteria. So that will allow for an expedited process for coverage to be renewed for those adults with 0 income, which we were happy about because this most likely includes a lot of adults who are experiencing homelessness. Unfortunately, originally we were looking to have all people experiencing homelessness included in there, along with those below 33% of the federal poverty level, which is still pretty low, but again, want to make sure that these are targeted at our lowest income adults with the greatest need. But because of the large fiscal note, these populations were cut from the initial waiver, but were included in a feasibility study that will be conducted alongside the original waiver. And the feasibility study will be stakeholder informed. That will take a look at the possibility of expanding the waiver to include older children between the ages of 6 to 18, people who have been involved with the criminal justice system, people experiencing homelessness, low-income adults. And we're hoping that that study reveals the positive impacts like we already have seen throughout the pandemic, and we can expand that. And thank you to the sponsors. That's Representatives Byrd and Sirota, and Senators Zenzinger and Kirkmeyer, and our partners at the Colorado Children's Campaign for introducing that. The next bill, Senate Bill 002, would authorize HCPF to seek federal authorization to allow community health workers to be reimbursed under Medicaid. So when we talk about community health workers, that's frontline public health workers who are also trusted members of the community that really have a nuanced understanding and on-the-ground knowledge of the community that they're serving. And this can include health promoters, community outreach workers, health navigators, peer navigators. They really go by many names, but play a really critical role in the health system coverage. Currently, the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless does not employ community health workers, but this helps create a pathway for us to do so in the future. So we really appreciated that this bill was passed with strong bipartisan support in both chambers. Next section here is substance use and harm reduction, which was also a big topic this year's legislative session. And I'll try to work through these quickly, but there is a lot to know here. The first bill that we engaged on is House Bill 231161, which is reporting of emergency overdose events and really seeks to strengthen Colorado's Good Samaritan laws. When we talk about Good Samaritan laws, we're talking about laws that expand immunity from persecution and arrest for those who seek out and administer life-saving aid during emergency overdose events. So if there's someone who overdoses and there's someone else on site, this allows the other person or incentivizes the other person to seek out help and administer help themselves if they're able. We know that using drugs alone and overdosing alone is one of the highest risk factors for death and overdose death. And we really want to make sure that people who have resources will actually use them. And unfortunately, this piece of legislation was weakened at the session last year, and this sought to go back and strengthen some of those provisions. So we are glad to see that pass. Second one, Senate Bill 23109 is one that the Colorado Coalition opposed. Criminal penalty controlled substance supplier, also known as a drug-induced homicide bill colloquially. The bill would make it a level 1 drug felony if a person shares or sells drugs that result in an overdose death. Originally, only fentanyl was included, but they sought to expand the scope. There was concerns about figuring out which drug was the cause of overdose, but we know that drug-induced homicide laws have not worked in other states that they were implemented. And actually, recently, Colorado, having rejected this bill, Colorado will join Utah and Wyoming in rejecting the legislation. So Colorado, it's worth noting that Utah and Wyoming were Republican-controlled legislatures, and Colorado had a more extreme version, but we were happy to join them in rejecting the bill. It would unfortunately undermine the Good Samaritan laws that we just mentioned, and they're not shown to decrease drug use, drug sales, or overdose death, but unfortunately they do target people, like we said, those people who are on site while there's use. Oftentimes we know people share drugs with family members, friends, and it goes after them instead of targeting drug traffickers, the kingpins that the bill claims to. And due to strong advocacy efforts and a really good showing from a lot of nonprofit partners and community members, this bill was killed in the House Judiciary. The third bill under this category is the OPC, or Overdose Prevention Center Authorization Bill, that would define what an overdose prevention center is and allow municipalities to authorize these centers. And it would play an important role in preventing overdose deaths without any fiscal note. Currently, there are almost 200 overdose prevention sites in about 16 countries, including the US, Canada, Australia, Mexico, and across Europe, and no one has ever died of an overdose while utilizing an overdose prevention center. So they're very effective, very safe. I think we heard a lot of opposition talking about how we don't want drugs to be on the streets, how we don't want people using in public. And I think this bill would have done a fantastic job at actually taking that public use and bringing it somewhere safe where people have sterile equipment. There's trained staff, tools to test drugs, so people know what's in this really unpredictable drug supply. And there are staff that can answer questions and administer first aid. You have medical professionals actually working with people when they are in crisis and when they do overdose. Unfortunately, this bill failed in the Senate Health and Human Services Committee. But again, this is something that we'd really like to revisit in the future, making sure we can provide solutions. We know that the #1 way for someone to access treatment is if they are alive. So we can want to do whatever we can to prevent overdoses. And last one I'll just touch on quickly. We weren't as involved in this, but this requires a recovery residence or sober living facility to implement a client discharge and transfer policy in the case of certain violations. So if someone is living in one of these facilities, it established a more formal procedure for their discharge. The coalition had some concerns about due process there in case someone is falsely accused and the risk of homelessness. But the bill ultimately did pass in the House and unanimously in the Senate. And last final issue, criminal legal reform that the coalition engaged on. There were two main bills here. The first was House Bill 23-1135, penalty for indecent exposure in view of minors. And this bill would have increased the penalty for indecent exposure in front of a child. The coalition opposed this bill originally because of concerns that people experiencing homelessness who are engaging in really basic acts of survival might be targeted by this bill. But we were brought to a neutral position when, with some amendments that specify that that this must be done knowingly. And this bill passed in the House and Senate. And final bill, House Bill 23-1133, will reduce the cost of phone calls for persons in custody. This is a bill that we are really happy to be a part of. We know that building and sustaining relationships while incarcerated is really important for breaking the cycle of poverty, incarceration, homelessness. And it can be really hard to maintain and even develop these networks while someone has to pay and really go through the burdensome cost that a lot of prisons have for making phone calls. We heard in testimony that people over years have spent thousands and thousands of dollars trying to call their loved ones. Really heartbreaking stuff. So we are very glad to see this bill pass. Next slide here. And we'll be talking about a lot of bills that we've been engaged on. I think it's really, really important to note that we really couldn't have done any of this without our fantastic partners, other organizations that we work with. This is by no means an exhaustive list. We have a lot of community members that have been very active, CCH staff and our advocacy committee and advocacy network. But this work really is a group effort and couldn't be done without all this coalition work and stakeholdering with all of our partners. So I want to extend a huge shout out. Thank you so much. We love all our partners. And to wrap up here, that's enough of me. I'm going to pass it back to Kathy.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Aubrey. I am so exhausted listening just to you guys talking about everything that we were involved in. We were definitely busy this year. And I don't think that the year of housing is over. I think we're probably more like into the generation of housing because as a state in Colorado, we haven't done enough to prevent this affordable housing crisis that we're in, the homelessness crisis that we're in. And so we've got a lot of catching up to do. So I anticipate we'll have another couple busy legislative sessions ahead, and we hope you all will stay with us. And here's some of the ways that you can stay engaged. You can always follow us on social media, as I mentioned. You can join our advocacy committee or network. There's an opportunity to do that online. I hope that all of you are getting our email alerts, the information in the news and our quarterly updates. Take a look at the legislative wrap-up report, which we just completed today, and has already been shared, I believe, in the chat, but will also be shared by link in the follow-up email. You can revisit all of the stuff that we were able to talk about and even more that we weren't able to discuss this evening. And definitely take a look at the how to access our General Assembly and lawmaking process in Colorado tool, because we really do want folks to know that, you know, this is their house. These are the people they voted for. This is the process that governs everything that they do, essentially. And so you should be able to tune in, listen in, and engage with your elected officials. We'll be reaching out probably in the fall with our new set of legislative priorities, though they don't change drastically, but we'll probably have we'll have a little more information about what pieces and parts of some of the legislation that didn't make it this year will be back up again next year. And so we look forward to having you all join us in doing some additional advocacy starting next January. But before next January, next slide, please. Don't forget to join us next month for our next education series event, which will be healthcare and housing. We know that housing is healthcare, healthcare is housing, and the two are, so linked together. And we're going to have a really in-depth discussion about this relationship and about why we advocate for housing as healthcare. So that's all we have tonight. I don't know if we have any remaining questions in the Q&A. I know there was one question about Lakewood homelessness, what I was going to respond was, there are new resources coming available in July through this Proposition 123 funds that nonprofits will have access to, and I just highly encourage nonprofits that are involved in this work or are interested in getting involved in this work to take advantage of that opportunity to get some dollars in the door to start addressing the immediate crisis in homelessness. I hope that Lakewood will eventually opt into the Proposition 123 schematic and be eligible for those funds at the government level. But prior to that even happening, nonprofits should be looking at this as a funding source to get dollars out immediately. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. We have 7 minutes left, so I don't know. I want to give my co-speakers the opportunity to see if I missed anything before we completely wrap up. But we do appreciate your support, your engagement with us, and we'll see you next month.